Welcome back. Well, the US surge, which started in February, has seen nearly 30,000 extra troops being sent to Iraq. Their goal, to curb sectarian fighting and bring the violence in Baghdad under control. But almost 6 months later, has it really worked? The Iraqi government seems to think so. It says the number of civilians killed in June fell to the lowest level since the surge began. Yet these figures have not been independently verified. Moreover, June ended the deadliest 3 months for US troops since the war began in 2003, with 330 soldiers killed. And the spate of recent bombings paints a disturbing picture. Around 250 people were killed in violence at the weekend, making it one of the deadliest since the 2003 invasion. Well, joining us again, our guests in Washington, Phyllis Bennis, Director of the New Internationalism Project at the Institute for Policy Studies. In London, Salam Mokhtar, an Iraqi expert. And here in Doha, Scott Bates, Vice President of the Center for National Policy. Scott Bates, let me start with you again. If American troops do stay in Iraq, how do you see their roles changing? I mean, do they need to train the Iraqis to secure their own country? How does it work from here on in?
Well, I think that's right. The roles really need to go back to core U.S. national security concerns, and those are, number one, finding and destroying al-Qaeda, and number two, training up Iraqi security troops. I mean, the fact is, any Iraqi official is going to tell you that their security troops need more work, and it's a job that takes years, and I'm talking 5 years at a minimum. And the U.S. military is the best in the world at doing what they do, which is training an effective fighting force. And getting back to the number one issue here, the U.S. Is still at war with al-Qaeda, bottom line. And chaos in Iraq means potential bases for al-Qaeda. Now, it's well and good to talk about that maybe we shouldn't have gone in the first place, but now it's 4 to 5 years onward, and we have the situation that we have right now. And the question for the U.S. is, can we walk away from that entirely? And my guess is that that's probably going to be no, that there's going to be a residual presence, as Phyllis was talking about. There seems to be a consensus on that emerging on Capitol Hill, and that would be dedicated to making sure that we have an ability to strike al-Qaeda when necessary.
Salam Mokhtar in London, let me bring you back into this. Many people say the very presence of US troops in Iraq actually provokes the violence to some extent. If they left, would it allow Iraq's feuding politicians to bury their sectarian differences? But it's not going to be as easy as that, though, is it?
No, it isn't. And they're not going to bury their differences. But what you're going to have a balance of terror. At the present moment, the various militias are backed by various ministers and various ministries. They are backed by the Americans in certain instances. Sometimes they team up with Fadila against Muqtada Sadr. Another time they team up with the Shiites against the Sunnis. So the Americans are behaving as one of the militias. If the Americans leave, the militias themselves, there will be a balance of terror between them that I think it will reduce the casualties of the civilians that we are seeing them being slaughtered every day by the militias. Because at the present moment, nobody knows who is in control, where and when. And whenever they are in trouble, some of the militias, they call on the Americans. There is this mythical exercise. Somehow we have to continue to believe of this new Rambo, which is called the Al-Qaeda, which is, again, fighting terrorism, this concept which we have been working on for the last few years, which nobody knows what is the address of the terrorism. The address of the terrorism is the policies of the USA in occupying a country and calling it liberation, calling the resistance terrorist, supporting the various factions, dismantling a state, and yet we are saying that all those people who are fighting it are terrorists and they are the Qaeda.
All right, I can see Scott Bates shaking his head there. Do you want to interject, Mr. Bates?
Well, I sure do, because there is something called al-Qaeda that attacked the United States in 2001, and 3,000 people were killed, one of whom came from my hometown. So I have to say that this is a real war. It is not a figment of anyone's imagination, that al-Qaeda is striking at targets around the world. And yes, I agree that we have to pursue policies that don't inflame passions of those that might want to join al-Qaeda. At the same time, we need to maintain a very limited and strong capability against al-Qaeda. I would suggest, for instance, the bulk of the forces that might be in Iraq would be special forces. They wouldn't be patrolling streets. They'd be used in very discreet and focused and targeted strikes against al-Qaeda.
Okay, I want to just bring in back Phyllis Bennis from Washington there, because there is evidence of a new Iraq strategy emerging in Washington, one that moves away from this grand idea about reforming Iraq to perhaps one that takes the fight to al-Qaeda, Scott Bates seems to think. Is there a shift in U.S. strategy, do you think?
I think that there is a shift back to the strategy that was proposed some months ago by the so-called Baker-Hamilton Commission, which was very much a bipartisan representation of elite opinion in the United States that sees the potential for a permanent occupation of Iraq. A smaller number of troops than we now have, a slightly different mission, but mainly an occupation light, if you will, an occupation that will not have as much opposition. That's the key, and that's why the White House is now beginning to look at it that way. Whether President Bush is or not, I don't know, but certainly the more pragmatic, less ideological people like Condoleezza Rice and Robert Gates are taking that position much more seriously, that we can do this in a way that gives us permanent occupation of Iraq in complete violation of international law, without having massive opposition, if we just do it in a slightly different way, less aggressive, less visible. The visibility is crucial here. And I think that's what's very dangerous about this kind of a conversation. What happened on September 11, despite the last remark about how this made it war, that was an act of terrorism. It was a crime against humanity. It was not an act of war by one country against another. The US made it an act of global war, and this now so-called global war on terror has become an ideological framework justifying a global war without borders, without limits, and without acquiescence to international law, the same laws that we demand that other countries obey.
Okay, Salam Mokhtar, I can see you nodding your head in approval there. Do you want to jump in?
Yes, certainly. I think this idea that there are terrorist acts, we in London have just faced some of them, Madrid, everywhere. We've seen terrorist acts. But occupation, any thought that any occupation, that a nice occupation that people can acquiesce with is a nonsensical exercise. Iraqis are not Martians. Nobody in the world likes occupiers, whether they are spreading Islam or Christianity or human rights or whatever. The occupation is the cause. It is unifying even the opposition in the Iraqis, the opposed sides, to fight the Americans, and it's causing more terrorist acts because of frustration. When you cannot get your right on, then that's what people are driving them into terrorism.
Okay, Scott Bates, let's move on just a little bit, because America's top soldier in Iraq, General David Petraeus, said they could be there for another 10 years fighting the insurgents, but surely US public opinion won't allow that, will it?
Well, I think that's right. You know, the American people are short on patience, and that's sometimes a virtue and sometimes that's not so great. So I don't see that as politically sustainable at all, at least not an American role on the streets every day in the numbers that we have right now. So, you know, I think
That's precisely the problem.
So I think General Petraeus is right in saying that they could fight for another 10 years, the insurgents, but I also think that the kind of presence we have right now might sustain the insurgency, and so it might be wise to pull back a little bit and take the air out of the insurgency that way.
Okay, I'm afraid that's all we have time for. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Scott Bates in Doha, Salam Mokhtar in London, and Phyllis Bennis in Washington. Thank you all very much, and thank you for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. We welcome your comments and suggestions. Please email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. From the whole team here, goodbye for now.